few days ago at the United Nations, the General Assembly made a decision which has been widely acknowledged as the most important in its history. The decision was to admit the representatives of the government of Mao Zedong as representatives of China and to expel the representatives of the government of Chiang Kai-shek who had represented China for 22 years. The ambassador of the President of the United States in the United Nations fought for a compromise. He was willing to admit the representatives of Mao Zedong to the Security Council exclusively and to the General Assembly, but not exclusively. He insisted that the government of Taiwan owned a seat in the General Assembly representing 15-odd million Chinese who are not subservient to mainland China. He lost, we lost, in a vote so dramatic that it has been interpreted as the crystallization within the United Nations of a working anti-American majority. Here to discuss the implications of that vote are the American ambassador, Mr. Bush, and the chief of the Taiwan Chinese Information Service, Mr. Yi-Cheng Lo. Mr. Bush was appointed ambassador to the UN last spring. He is a conspicuously talented human being, a son of a United States senator from Connecticut, expatriate to Texas, graduate of Andover and Yale, Navy fighter pilot shot down during the war in the China Sea, decorated, captain of a baseball team, entrepreneur in the oil business, congressman from Texas, narrowly defeated senatorial candidate from Texas. Mr. Gene Lo is a graduate of National Cheng Chi University in Nanking, with a graduate degree in journalism at Columbia University, a veteran of 2 wars who received the Medal of Freedom from the United States government for his work in Korea. For almost 10 years, he has made the case for nationalist China as chief information officer, and finally last Monday, he lost. I should like to begin by asking Ambassador Bush the preliminary question: are you at liberty to disclose the exact nature of your instructions from President Nixon?
Yes, sir. Our instructions were to execute, carry out to the fullest degree the policy of dual representation. And this envisaged, as you said in the preamble, affirming representation for the People's Republic in the United Nations and affirming the continued representation of the Republic of China. Inherent in these instructions was battling against the very dangerous precedent of expulsion, something that the United Nations had not done, something that our opponents said wasn't happening, though the word expel was used because they were maintaining that we were talking about restoration of the legal rights and thus it wasn't expulsion. And so I was instructed to execute this policy as best we could.
Well, now, when people talk, as they have in the last few days, about your steamrolling tactics, what do they have in mind?
Well, some talk about steamrolling, and now, ironically, as of this very weekend, why some are saying we didn't steamroll enough.
Kind of a spongy steamroller, isn't it?
Well, it was. And arm twisting, I wish that I could say on the air when General Romulo called me over and said, I said, well, I hope you aren't concerned about these stories of arm twisting, and he used a beautiful Texas expression to explain twisting. He said, well, we need to do more of it. I must refrain from saying what it was, but there was some accused us of arm twisting, others accused us of now, in the wake of what I consider a defeat, frankly, for the United Nations, of not doing enough. What we tried to do was forcefully represent the position of the United States government, of our many co-sponsors, of the Japanese, the countries that are very closely affected by this decision, the peripheral countries of Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Philippines, Thailand, forcefully, all of us, forcefully representing these positions with what I felt was a high sense of advocacy, and I hope honor, to other countries. We started off, of course, with many of our staunchest allies against us, and they remained against us. But I need to know what a definition of arm twisting is, because we advocated the policy. I happen to believe in it. I happen to strongly feel that it made sense for the United Nations. I happen to feel that it was the only way that the Republic of China would continue to be represented in the United Nations. And I believe strongly. My problem was I believed our policy, Mr. Buckley. And if that's arm twisting by talking forcefully to the small delegates about it, delegations, I must plead guilty. But in terms, some felt that maybe we should have threatened or said, well, if you don't do this, we're going to curtail aid. We didn't do that, and that's, I suppose, open to debate as to whether we should have conducted ourselves differently. But we conducted a very forceful campaign. The President was keenly interested in it personally, and the Secretary of State had some 90 consultations, so practically hoarse up here, trying to get this across. And there was work in capitals. And the other thing I'd like to say before concluding an answer that turned into a speech is that this work went on in capitals, and it went on not just by the United States, but by many, many other countries who are close allies of the Republic of China.
Mr. Loeb, may I ask you, is it your impression or the impression of your government that the United States worked less diligently than it might have to avoid the result you deplore?
I certainly did not get the impression from Ambassador Bush's hard work. I want to take this opportunity, sir, to say that we deeply appreciate the effort of Ambassador Bush and the entire United States mission that in this past few weeks.
Well, let me ask you this. If you had been President of the United States, could you have devised supplementary policies that might have made the steamroller more effective?
I wish I were, but I can't answer. That's too hypothetical for me, Bill.
In other words, you are willing then to accept the verdict of the United Nations as more or less historically determined, as something that was outside the power of the United States to forestall?
No, this is not what I mean. What I mean is we, the Chinese, have a philosophy, and it is that we do our best, and then we leave the rest to whatever the powers that be up above. We believe that we've done a good fight. We believe many of our friends have put in a good fight. There are different assessments of whether that fight could have been more effective or less effective. But after the vote Monday night, we feel this is time for us to look forward and not to look backward. This is no time at all to apportion blame.
Don't you think a little recrimination can be useful sometimes? I mean, that's what Nuremberg was all about, wasn't it?
That was in the case of Nuremberg, but we would like, in the traditional Chinese philosophy, to shoulder all responsibilities ourselves.
Well, now, I've heard it said that if it had not been for Mr. Nixon's initiative in Peking last July, the vote would have gone substantially as it went anyway. Would you agree with that prediction or not?
Oh, personally, yes. I think it has a lot to do with the entire change of atmosphere at the United Nations.
No, you misunderstood me. I said it has been said that if Mr. Nixon hadn't sent Mr. Kissinger to China at all, it would not have affected the vote, i.e. that it was in the cards.
You were referring to Mr. Kissinger's second visit. Or the whole announcement.
The July one.
Because, yes, the July one.
Let's take the July one.
The July one, of course, this is what, let's face it, this is what caused the entire shift. The United States has done a 180-degree shift in its positions, and this naturally affected the decision of other countries.
Did it affect it critically?
Critically, yes.
Mr. Ambassador, would you agree?
No, I wouldn't say that let me stop by saying that it could have had some effect, but I wouldn't say critically. And the reason I say that is that last year the Albanian resolution got won by 51 to 49. We were able, as my friend knows, with the support of other allies, to uphold the important question, what we call the non-expulsion resolution, and thus forestall the expulsion of the Republic of China. And I believe these numbers are correct, but subsequent to last year's vote, I believe that 12 different countries established relations with the Peking and broke off relations with the Republic of China. And inherent in those relationships was the recognition that Peking was the sole legitimate government. So my own view is if there had not been a shift, and this isn't exactly on the point, Bill, but if there had not been a shift in policy to envisage both being in the United Nations, the effort would have been destined to failure from the very beginning. It was difficult to attract co-sponsors in preliminary diplomatic initiatives without a recognition that the People's Republic of China should have their representation affirmed. Now, I'm not sitting here saying there was no effect. I am saying that I don't think that this will is the decisive effect, although certainly some could argue that it started a race for Peking and who wants to get there first and we would be hurt. But I think given the numbers from last year that we adopted the only realistic policy, trip or no trip, that would keep the Republic of China in the United Nations. We did not succeed in it. But that I have a slight difference with my friend on this particular point.
Well, would you go so far as to say that the position, that to the extent that the government in Taiwan adopted the same position as the Red Chinese, i.e. that Taiwan was a part of China, it made theoretically difficult the position you were attempting to promote?
It made it very difficult, but we felt, and this did not get through, our policy was continued to be called a two-China policy when technically it wasn't. We did not juridically try to solve this dispute that exists as to who is the legitimate government, and we felt that we gave those, even those that had recognized Peking, leeway to support our position. But we felt that this, without trying to solve this thing once and for all, leaving the door open on it, simply saying, here's a reality, here's another reality, that we were leaving, we thought we would give people who were negotiating with Peking, who had established relations with Peking, flexibility. It proved not to be, some were, simply said, well, you can't be serious about this, and this was a factor there.
And Mr. Lowe's government made this difficult for you?
No, Mr. Lowe's government, I must say, well, difficult only in that they couldn't, no, they made it not difficult on dual representation. The very fact there was this broad division, you see, made it difficult, but that we weren't asking them to resolve that problem. There was some feeling in the United Nations of that, well, the U.S. can't be serious about this. I will admit that. We tried to argue very hard through a lot of diplomatic initiative and plus this non-juridical concept that we were desperately serious about two things. One, retaining the seat for the Republic of China, and two, the precedent of expulsion, battling against that. I don't think they made it difficult for us. In fact, I think history will show that once the policy was set, they were extremely cooperative, and I've had high-level representations extremely grateful for the energies expended and for the work done, and they did a lot of diplomatic work themselves. They had certainly had some home consumption problems that made the frankest disclosure possible, difficult.
Well, Mr. Lowe, don't you suppose that there must have been some, let's assume that there are a few countries in the United Nations that interest themselves in principle. Wouldn't you suppose that they were baffled by the fact that your claims and those of Red China were exactly equal on the point that there ought to be a single representative for the twin areas, and that you therefore might have played into the hands of the enemy as a result of pursuing that point?
It only appears on the surface baffling, but I think that we explained it very, very clearly to all our friendly countries in the UN. You realize as well as everyone else that even after we walked out of the General Assembly Monday night, there's still 35 countries who voted for us. They could very well have jumped on the bandwagon. It was a futile exercise for them to vote against it, but I think they stick to principles. And I do not think any of these, or even some of the others, had any misunderstanding in their mind as to exactly where my country stood. And in this regard, I think...
Sticking to principles when you had urged them to take the position that Taiwan and China is a single entity, and under the circumstances ought to be represented by a single government. That becomes then a choice of your government or the communist government. Now, aren't they saying, well, we would prefer it if Mr. Lowe's government would permit us to think of them as two entities, but since you excluded that, didn't logic drive
Well,
them?
let me put it this way. Diplomacy, some said, is the art to disagree on the thing. And I think there had been no difficulty when we made our position clear to these governments on the one hand because of our constitutional requirement, because of the standing national policy of government. We cannot ourselves agree, for example, with the due representation policy, but we would understand if the other governments, for reasons that they would like to see us continue to be represented in the United Nations. I think that was made quite clear, as the ambassador pointed out. I don't think there ever was any confusion in any of the chief delegates' mind as to where we stand in the first place and what would be the possible result on the other.
Okay, Mr. Bush, let me ask you this then. Now, you say that as regards expulsion, a very dangerous precedent has been set. Do you understand the United Nations to have embarked on a new doctrinal course? Or do you think historians will interpret the events of the last few days as being signifying primarily a shift in the relationships of power, which makes the parliamentary aspect really meaningless, but the existential aspect of considerable strategic importance?
It's too early to tell. Certainly, right now, it's going to be viewed as this shift in power. We were deadly serious when we were talking about the precedent of expulsion. Just in the paper yesterday morning, a few days ago, I read some, and I don't know to the degree of this man's responsibility or irresponsibility, representing an Arab group suggesting, hooray, the precedent is set, so these people that don't abide by the UN resolutions can be thrown out by 50%. History will tell whether anybody's going to execute this, but we wanted to guard against this. And we did not get through to our friends and allies. We made the most, and because they were saying, we're not dealing with expulsion. As Mr. Lowe knows, we're dealing with the restoration of the lawful rights. Please don't talk about expulsion. You're confusing things, Ambassador Bush, by discussing this. The Secretary of State made a very strong statement about this precedent of expulsion. And our great friends in Europe, with whom we happen to disagree very strongly on this, we're saying, look, you know, you're just throwing up a smoke screen. We weren't. We believe it. So I think Bill, history is going to tell whether we were just going through the motions. But there's an emotional atmosphere in the UN, and Monday night it was the Republic of China. They can call it something else. We call it expulsion. Some other night, it could be South Africa, given the emotion of the place. Some other night, and you go right down the list. So we were battling against the precedent of expulsion. Well, history will answer that question.
I grant that history will, but in a sense that is a cop-out, isn't it? But we've got to give history a helping hand. Now,
well, I hope you'll be smart enough not to do this,
sure,
not to exercise this precedent that's been set.
Well, now, is this safe to say that if tomorrow the majority of the Assembly of the United Nations were to vote to say that in as much as it has acted on the subject, any power, any nation that maintained a separate embassy in Taiwan was doing so in defiance of the findings of the General Assembly and therefore was itself subject to expulsion? Now, it would be preposterous, A, that it should do that, or B, that you would pay any attention to it if it did.
Well, certainly the last two things are true, and I can hardly see anybody saying that a representation in the UN prevents people from having whatever bilateral relations they want. Germany, for example, is not represented in the United Nations. Switzerland's not represented, and nobody has yet raised the question. So I would hope that nobody would carry this example that far.
Well, but suppose Red China, having been seated, insists that our military presence in Taiwan is an act of aggression on a territory that is juridically theirs by a vote of the United Nations. What do you do?
Well, what we do is say,
look,
look,
go to hell or what?
We phrase it more diplomat. That's when I was a politician, I would have phrased it. Now I'm an instant diplomat, and I'd phrase it very differently. But I would say, look, the President of the United States has said he's going to uphold his commitments, and please don't discuss this any further. We are going to uphold our commitments to the Republic of China. Next subject, please, sir.
Yes, but suppose they say, much as we'd like to oblige you, we will not change the subject. We are going to press for the logical extension of the policies that were voted in October. And the logical extension is that Americans have no right to have military forces on Chinese territory. And how do you defend yourself in a situation like that? How do you defend us?
We would simply argue that our bilateral relations are our bilateral relations, and if this is the policy of the United States government, this will be the policy of the United States government. And I don't see that they, you know, they can pass a lot of resolutions over there that some could suggest would bind. And one of the problems at the UN is that when a motion prevails, there's a tendency there to talk about punitive action that will commit countries to war and this kind of thing. And that fortunately hasn't happened very much. But you're posing a hypothetical problem to which I don't know the intermediate action there, but I know the final answer, and that is that the United States government would not stand for that. And the President has made that clear.
Mm-hmm. Well, suppose they said we want bilateral relations with the state of Kansas. We obviously would not permit that, would we?
No, we would not.
No, well, the reason I say that is because they are, I should think, now in a position, under the rubric of the recent decision, to press the claims against us, which would be equivalent to our claims against them if they were all of a sudden, as I say, to start relations with Kansas or Hawaii, if you want to make it geographically more plausible. Yeah. Now, are you really saying, in effect, that the United Nations, by its vote last Monday, has really stitched itself into uselessness because they have invited impasse, and having done so, necessarily they will go into desuetude?
No, I can't say that it's uselessness, because in spite of the what I think was a major step backwards, not only in the precedent but in the treatment of decent people, and this troubled me, and it was called glee. Something much more transcended glee. In spite of this, and in spite of my deep personal involvement and regret, and our country's concern about the fact that the UN took a step backwards, I can't say that this one action alone makes it a useless organization, because I think there are things there that are to the interests of every citizen in the United States to support. And so I would hope that this would not be history's.
Well, let me ask you this, though, Mr. Bush. Your background has always led you to abide by parliamentary majorities, right? When you won the vote in Texas, you went to Congress. When you lost it, you didn't go to the Senate. When you were elected to something and captain of the baseball team, you took office. If you hadn't been, you would not have taken office. Now, what is the purpose of a vote in the United Nations, a vote in which you participate, if it isn't a vote which you are willing to observe the majority dictate of?
Well, we're willing to observe the majority dictate that Peking be seated, and with great regret that the Republic of China be expelled, and that's it. That's what we're willing to observe.
But the implications of that vote, surely, are that Taiwan is a province of China, and you are not accepting the implications of that vote unless you therefore proceed to discharge the ambassador from Taiwan and accept one from Peking, are you?
No, we will not go that far. We are going to retain our rights to conduct our diplomacy. We are not assigning away all sovereignty to the United Nations. This is not a hallmark of our policy, nor, in my view, should it be.
But when
We're supporting it when we can.
When the United Nations tells you to boycott Rhodesia, you boycott Rhodesia, right?
Well,
or is it only because it happens to coincide with our policy? If so, why didn't you do it ahead of time?
I think in the final analysis, the United States is going to have to reserve unto itself its, just as every other country does there, its major policy decisions. And this one has been determined by the President, and this one I'm convinced he won't waver from because of an unfortunate action that with which we disagreed.
Well, Mr. Lowe, as you know, for 10 or 15 years, the so-called Holstein Doctrine prevailed in Europe, the terms of which were that West Germany would not recognize any government which recognized East Germany. Will you come forward with an equivalent of that, i.e., will you refuse to recognize any country that recognizes the Mao Zedong government in China?
It has been our policy in the past.
How about the future?
The future, I do not know, but I think
Don't tell us that history will decide.
No, but I think it's like the UN situation. I'm somewhat relieved after the, strange to say, after the Monday night vote, because it solved a dilemma for us.
Because what?
Because it solved a dilemma for us. We didn't have to choose. We were voted out, so we walked out before the vote took place.
But you're going to have
to choose now. And this was the same thing. Canada, for example, started from a two-China policy. And in 19 or 20 months of negotiation with the Chinese communists, Mao insisted it could only be a one-China policy, so Canada switched. And this is the case with all the countries that has, so far, tried to recognize Peking. Mr. Trudeau started, I think he was doing Chinese communists a favor by recognizing him. Later on, he found out that he had to beg them to accept his recognition. And he has to swallow his pride and swallow the whatever condition that Mao has given him. And that condition has been that they must sever all relations with us, not only diplomatic, but also it's also trade, also everything. It was made even clear that they could not even allow the remaining of a trade delegation of us. So I think this problem will not come up at all.
Isn't there? I'd like, is it appropriate for me?
Sir.
Isn't there a flexibility in some of the formula that have been adopted, such as in the Cameroons and Kuwait on this, though? Haven't they been less rigid as they establish or approach the establishment of diplomatic relations with Peking? And in other words, haven't they tried to leave the door open to a presence in their countries of both the Republic of China and the People's Republic or not? What is the flexibility? Haven't they been pressing for a flexibility that will get away from the point that Mr. Buckley was just talking about?
We've had many friendly countries, including the United States, that urge us to be more flexible. And it's the policy now is to adopt a case-by-case basis. I do not know about Kuwait. I believe our embassy was closed on the insistence of the Chinese communists.
No, I just thought the formula under which these negotiations were, maybe in that case it turned out to be the same old formula, but in my view, in my recollection, I think that some of these formula were negotiated so there is a flexibility under which both can exist. I guess it hasn't happened yet, but I had a feeling that your government was demonstrating some flexibility there, where in the past there had, or was encouraging flexibility there, where in the past it had not been able to do that.
So Mr. Agnew calls squishy thought.
Well, as I say, we haven't. Yes, we were willing to we were probing all sort of possibilities. We have encouraged the continuance of trade relations, expanding trade relations with many countries which broke with us in the past. I just read.
Is there any country in the world in which you and Peking have an ambassador?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Would you
I just read this morning that Canada, for example, after they broke with us last year, our trade with Canada jumped 74% since 1970. So we are doing all sort of things to try to promote bilateral relations, to expand trade, to expand economic contact. And I'm very glad to report that our economic muscle seems to be paying off.
think that showed in the African vote, where you got 50% of the African countries on the important question vote, which was,
yes.
It demonstrated that they had reached out, they'd been constructive citizens of the world trying to help people, and some remembered it.
Yes, not only that, but among the 35 that stuck with us to the end, 15 of these are from Africa.
Well, it's true, isn't it, that there's a certain hostility among certain nations in Africa as a result of certain practices of the Chinese communists that might have contributed to that.
No question.
It must have had, yes, of course.
Yeah. All right. Well, now let me ask you this, Mr. Bush. As you project the situation in terms of the future of the United Nations, do you believe that the instrument of expulsion has now become so easy that it is going to be the way by which the UN typically chooses to exercise sanctions?
I would hope not, because many of the people that voted against us, particularly our European allies, our NATO allies, Britain would be one that immediately came to mind, would argue that they weren't dealing with expulsion, and thus we would have many people shift over if the question, in other words, I don't think you can take the important question vote simply as those who are on this expulsion theme, because many of the Nordic countries and others would vehemently argue that they weren't expelling something. It said expel, and this is what troubled me. It says expel. But then they say, oh yeah, but it says expel the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek. It did not dignify them by calling them a government. And we feel the precedent was there. These other countries would join us, however, in arguing that no, whatever the next case might be, expulsion by a 50% majority is wrong.
Well, if therefore somebody moved for the expulsion of, say, South Africa, your feeling is that that however loathsome its policies were to a lot of people, they would simply decline to expel it, decline to use this as a sanction.
I think we would argue, and I hope with some effect, that this would be a Chapter 6 thing that would have to go first through the Security Council and then 2/3 in the General Assembly, whereas on trying to argue that on the other one simply didn't work, because you had a parliamentary body that saw fit to say this was not expulsion. Today, our strongest allies won't recognize that we were legitimately arguing the question of expulsion. We believed it, and we simply could not get that across because of bilateral commitments. I believe Mr. Lowe would agree that had been sought out or thrust upon others who are with us on many other important issues.
Well, let me ask you then, Mr. Lowe, is it conceivable that your government could move formally in order to regularize the juridical situation, to secede from China, proceed with a plebiscite that approved that secession under international law, provided a part of a nation can succeed in its secession in the way that, for instance, Biafra did not succeed, it becomes entitled to de facto recognition. Would you consent to going through those steps in order to assert a claim for inclusion into the UN?
No, I cannot conceive that such a course would ever be taken by the Chinese government. There are two levels of argument against it. The first is we always say that we are Chinese. We always agree with the communist regime that there is only one Chinese nation. There's only one China. And secondly, any thought of
that, by the way?
Yes, but however, with the important proviso that after the Tibetan uprising, our president went on record in a formal statement that once Tibet, the Tibetan people would be free to exercise their own free will, the government will abide by their wish, even if they want self-determination. This is the difference.
Well, why wouldn't the government abide by the wish of Formosa to become independent?
No, because the government is Chinese, and secondarily, it's as I was saying, it wouldn't be practical for us to reapply as a separate country, for the very simple reason the new membership must receive approval of the Security Council. With the Chinese Communist regime sitting in the Security Council, I think it's it's a foregone conclusion.
It would simply be
There's
vetoed.
absolutely no possibility. We wouldn't even think of such a thing.
Miss Jervis. That's you, isn't it?
Yes, that's me. Mr. Bush, I think I agree with Mr. Lowe that that the real issue in the UN was a credentials fight between two sets of contending representatives, both saying that they represented all of the people of China. There are
Did I say that?
Well, you said that your government claims to represent all of the people of China.
Yes.
Is that true? Right, and I think that
Also
that the
induced it, yes.
Peking says the same thing. So I think I kind of agree with you on that.
Deduced it.
As far as I know, there are the same number of states in the United Nations now as there were about a week ago. Hasn't the question of expulsion then been raised only in relation to South Africa in the United Nations, which has repeatedly refused to comply with all of the United Nations directives regarding apartheid in that country? And can you name other states who are now afraid of expulsion?
Well, I mentioned an example, which I hope was an extreme example, in the state of Israel, which was brought up not by us and not by an official government organization, but by a professed, and I'm going to be very careful here not to accord the man more stature than he deserves in relation to Israel. But you see, where you and I differ is that there are two existing realities there. There are two existing realities. This governments, they've reached out to all over. They have into helping other countries. They're there. They're real, and they're not some individuals representing somebody. I mean, they're a legitimate government that's lived within the framework of nations constructively for a long, long, long time. Our country was prepared to say that Peking is a reality too. So this is why we didn't subscribe to the view of a credentials fight. We left open the question. We said if the UN is going to be more realistic, yes, it makes some sense to have quarter of the world's population represented. We believed that. That was one part of it. And the other part was that we don't believe the price tag ought to be the expulsion of an existing reality. No matter what you or I or the Europeans think of the credentials, they're both viable, independent realities. And this was the point that we obviously didn't get across, but it's the point that I remain convinced of it. So that's where you and I differ.
Mr. Cooper.
Yeah, Mr. Bush, you spoke before about arm twisting, and you then mentioned talking forcefully as somehow characteristic of the way that you had been accused of arm twisting. Now, in light of Nixon and Rogers' veiled threats, and today very much more substantive threats to withdraw funds from the UN, of which Mr. Buckley's brother is a sponsor of that resolution before.
Eloquent sponsor, please.
All right. I will even grant you that. Is a sponsor in our Senate of a bill before our Senate at the moment. In addition to the fact that there were reports that the U.S. had threatened to withdraw aid from small member nations of the UN.
That's not true.
All right. Well, in light of this resolution before,
just sort of get it out of the way, so
isn't that quite a bit like a rich child who strikes out at bat and then picks up his batting ball and goes home and breaks up the game?
That's not what we're going to do. But may I ask a clarifying question? You must have later information than I. What was the reference that was reinforced today that you made in threat?
Well, I heard on the
Because
radio this morning as I was brushing my teeth that indeed there were that these kinds of things were being talked about today in a more serious way than they had been.
Yeah. I think this is an understandable expression.
Now, you called it arm twisting.
I don't call it arm twisting. I say forceful diplomacy.
I would call it blackmail.
Well, this did not go. Maybe we got to start over. 1, we did not blackmail anybody. 2, we did not threaten anybody. Some feel we should have. We did not do that. 3, we have not talked about recrimination or reprisal against the United Nations. 4, the Secretary reinforced or restated his and our government's support. And so please read what the President of the United States has said on this subject, not what is implied. And I recognize that's difficult, because I went back, having seen the story about what was attributed to the President of the United States, and it simply, in my view, was an inaccurate interpretation of what Ziegler said several days ago at the press conference. There has been no threat. Now, let's not deceive ourselves. There is an understandable concern in the United States about the action taken by the United Nations. But the President and the Secretary of State, and much lesser importance, this ambassador, have not threatened, have not indicated in any way retaliation, have not supported any move that would appear to do just what you're concerned about, picking up the bat and ball to go home. Because in spite of our tremendous disappointment, I see things that we must support in the United Nations. So I'm pleased you asked that, and I hope I'm not twisting your arm by forcefully laying to rest what has been a mysterious myth ever since the United States embarked on a policy we strongly believed in. And it's been one I've had to shoot down. This UN is the darndest rumor factory you've ever seen. And this was one of them. The U.S. is twisting arms. And I want somebody to describe what it means. Give me an example.
Well, I did offer. I mean, there is a bill before the Senate right now, or an amendment to the foreign aid bill. Or
surely you're not suggesting
like
that senators should be muzzled and not express themselves. This is not all I want to say. No, I'm saying this is not the policy of the United States government. We've got to separate out what is the government policy and what is the expression of the people. And this I could never get across the strait. And please look at these statements made by the President and the Secretary, because this is our policy. I expect Mr. Buckley might argue with it, but this is the policy.
I'm always impressed by today's youth, always seem to apply double standards. Let me ask this gentleman, Mr. Cooper, back in the late 1950s, when Communist China wanted to monopolize the Second Bandung Conference, which is supposed to hold at Algiers. And then when they could not block the Russians from getting there, they could not get what they want, they simply torpedoed the whole Second Bandung Conference. Would you call that blackmail?
I just am not well acquainted enough with the facts.
You don't have to be. You don't have to be acquainted with them at all.
Oh, well, I think I do to have to make a judgment.
I thought you represent the concerned Asian scholars. If that's the case, Asia is your specialty, isn't it?
Well, it is. That's true. I'm an anthropologist by trade.
No, but if I might go back to the arm twisting, please, there has not been the threats and these things we were accused of. I remember one editorial that occurred that accused me of smoke room politics by a very distinguished editor, Mr. Reston, and I'm going to see him and ask him what it is he means, because we tried to conduct ourselves. Maybe it was too sportsmanlike, I don't know, but we did it forcefully, and we made very clear it was, in our view, to the interest of the United Nations, and we made it very clear we thought this policy was to the interest of the United States government. And beyond that, I think if you can't represent your government with a sense of advocacy in these halls, why, you're not serving the people. You're not serving the UN itself well. So it's here that we have a difference.
Ms. Frank.
I'd like to ask Ambassador Bush, if the United States felt justified in ignoring 700 million Chinese for over 20 years, why is it now deploring the loss of representation of 14 million on Taiwan, leaving aside the question of whether or not the people of Taiwan are really represented by their government?
Well, it seems to me the question, without being critical, is a little unrelated. One, we were affirming representation for Peking for various reasons I'd be glad to go into. But two, the question of continuing, we never wavered in our desire to have the Republic of China stay in.
No,
three,
you misunderstood her. She says, look, we went 19 years saying we're not going to recognize the reality of Mao Zedong governing China. Why should we be so shocked when only 5 days where the United Nations is adopting a similar position as regards Formosa? If we can ignore the de facto situation there, why can't they ignore the de facto situation there?
Well, because we think there have been changes in terms of Peking's desire to come into the UN, Peking's establishment reaching out to the world in terms of diplomatic relations. Peking's not saying... Well, Peking's saying
what's
at one
different
point...
between a year ago when we opposed Peking coming in and
well,
today?
What's different there is a very pragmatic difference, and that is that no longer could the representation of the Republic of China be preserved, for one thing, plus the fact that we've had a major shift in our policy, which seeks more communication with the People's Republic of China. But the point that I think we were getting off on is the kind of the degree of democracy of the Republic of China. And I'm not sure that it's our... if we started kind of analyzing, you know, the freedom of elections in every one of the 131 nations in the UN, if we were to be the judges of their degree of democracy or their degree of participation, I expect we'd have a rather small number of countries over there instead of 131. And this was the point. Maybe I did misunderstand the question, but I believe, is that responsive to part of your question or not?
I was more interested in the, as Mr. Buckley pointed out, in the question of the United States feeling that there was nothing wrong in the people of mainland China not being represented, whereas it does feel that it's wrong that the people of Taiwan are no longer represented. This switch in policy.
Yeah. Well, I think there had been changes that I mentioned, and I think that from a practical UN standpoint, believing in the retention of the Republic of China, had we had no desire, had the President not moved forward towards communication with Peking, please accept my judgment, and I'd like to know, Mr. Lowe's, whether there would have been any chance at all to sustain the status quo at the UN. My judgment is that it wouldn't, because the Albanian resolution having passed last year, and with the shift in diplomatic relations since then, whether we shifted our policy on Peking or not, I'm convinced that the status quo would not have been retained.
But isn't this fair to say, Mr. Lowe and George, isn't it fair to say that our position has been that the Mao Zedong government was an imposter government, point one, and point two, that its activities did not qualify it for membership under the criteria specified in the Charter, pure and simple. And what happened in the last year isn't that we consider it less of an imposter government. We have no reason at all to suppose that the 700 million people are being represented by the guy that Mao Zedong is going to send over here next week. On the contrary, we have every reason to suppose that he's sending over here somebody who is distinctly the enemy of the people. After all, they have to kill 2 or 3% of them every year, just to keep in mind. But we simply say we are living with the situation. There's nothing we can do about it. They continue to stand in the books of the United Nations as an aggressor, but you just got to get used to things. So the original position isn't that we were denying representation to the 700 million people, but that the government that sought to represent them had no legitimate grounds for doing so.
And that there have been some quite obvious changes from the Cultural Revolution days in terms of their approach to the United Nations and their desirability of coming here. Our view was, fine, it makes it more realistic at this point, and the President's approach towards communication, certainly not acceptance of ideology, but to communication, I think has strong support here. But we simply didn't think that it ought to be done. We thought the price tag was high. We thought it was being done on a without reference to the realistic and frankly law-abiding government that now has been expelled.
Well, why can't the United Nations say, well, we think the price tag is too high to ask us, in effect, to support a mutiny on the part of the people in Formosa against the people of mainland China, and under the circumstances we decline to acknowledge it?
Well, I don't think we are in the position, want to be in the position, and will be in the position of doing anything except protecting the interests of the Republic of China under our existing commitments. As we seek relations and communication with Peking, we don't do it in an aggressive fashion. We simply say, here again, I keep going back to, here are two realities, and inside the UN, it didn't work the way we wanted. Outside of the UN, we will uphold, the President has said, we will uphold our commitments to the Republic of China.
If I may cut in here, Bill.
Yes, sir.
The young lady apparently proceeds from the philosophy that the Chinese Communist regime represents the 700 million people on the mainland, and that my government does not represent the 14.8 million people in Taiwan, which is incidentally is more than exactly 100 are counted of the UN members in population. There is a working democratic system in Taiwan. Elections are held periodically. And also, I want to state this fact, which has perhaps escaped the young lady's attention. Earlier this year, in the show, The Advocates, that's broadcast over these same stations, our Vice President, C.K. Yan, went on the record as saying, my government is prepared to hold a plebiscite in Taiwan as long as the Chinese Communist government also agrees to hold a plebiscite on the mainland to decide which Chinese government they prefer. And I think until our offer, which is standing one, is taken up and put to a test, I don't think anyone could even allege that there is lack of popular support in Taiwan for our government.
Ms. Jervis.
Yes. Isn't it true, though, Mr. Lowe, on the same point that the central government of Taiwan is composed of a body similar to our legislative, judicial, and
yes.
executive branches, which include proportional representation from not only Taiwan, but from all the provinces of China,
yes.
leaving Taiwan a very, very small voice in the conduct of such matters as international affairs and as the UN question and so forth. I understand that there is a provincial government, but as far
yes.
as the central government's policies, is that not the
yes.
case?
You've done your homework well, but I do not know whether you realize the year before last there was an additional supplementary election held in Taiwan to re-elect, to add local representation on the national level, and that they are now studying means of further enlarging that representation. There have been many plans that have been now studied. From the most drastic one of scraping the setup altogether, conduct a re-election, to some modified ways of retaining a part but re-electing a large part of it. We are very aware of this. The government is doing everything it could within the constitutional framework to give the present population of Taiwan the largest possible participation in the government. This can be seen in many aspects. There's now 85% of the employees and local governments are native borns, and then more than 50% in the national level are also native borns. But our government has the problem that we brought over the Chinese constitution from the mainland. We owe it to our people, our brethren, that includes my father, my brother, and my sister on the mainland, to return the same constitutional guarantees to them. And therefore, you cannot simply, when you claim continuity in the constitutional system, you cannot simply just discard everything in the past. There was the precedents, for example, during the war. Mr. Churchill had to suspend elections in Britain until the war is won.
Mr. Cooper.
Yeah, I would wonder if you would, I'd like to put you in the sights of my firing line, if you don't mind for a moment. You spared, excuse me, you spared no effort in whitewashing Joe McCarthy's attacks on the supposed communists in our State Department in the early 1950s.
No, I spared some effort.
Well, all right. At any rate, you were quite vehement in your defense of McCarthy's attacks on the alleged communists in our State Department, who were supposedly responsible for undermining our support of the Chiang Kai-shek regime in the post-World War II period and in the early 1950s. Now, do you suppose that at this point, President Nixon, himself quite a capable advocate of a cause that you advocated in the 1950s, might be hiding some communists under his bed, and that he has gone over to their cause, and that it is the communists in President Nixon's regime who are responsible for the recent softening of America's China policy, and for his projected trip to Peking?
Oh,
and if not, don't you then feel that might be cause to re-examine some of your theories about the early 1950s?
Which?
About the reality of communist infiltration of the State Department, and that perhaps there may have been other kinds of factors involved in the people who upheld
because X is caused by Y does not mean that X mightn't have been caused by Z. If that's the answer, that's the answer to your question logically. As regards the question, is there a communist influence? The answer is, of course, manifest. The communist influence is extremely important. It's the kind of thing that causes us to subdue those distinctions, which are really quite stark. For instance, you get Mr. Bush's distinguished predecessor, Francis Plimpton, standing up in the United Nations 2 or 3 years ago and says, colonialism has ended in the world. Now, I can't imagine anybody saying that in the light of the fact that there are 13 or 14 countries in the world which, if they don't do exactly what they're told to do by the Soviet Union, they get things like tanks running over them, except that little by little, in the Orwellian sense, one becomes used to the vocabulary of people who are communists and whose aim is to corrupt the vocabulary. All you have to do is sit 15 minutes in the United Nations and listen to them talk about South Africa as something that ought to be the gravamen of the world's complaints. You know, people who step on the corpses of tens of millions of people, and you understand the communist influence is very, very considerable. Now you say, has it influenced Nixon? Of course it influences Nixon, in the sense that it influences reality. Mr. Nixon, as President of the United States, has to deal with the world as it is. The world as it is a world which absolutely accepts as completely workaday the tyranny of the Soviet Union, the tyranny of Mao Zedong, and simply proceeds on the basis of what's wrong with the Negro situation in the South. Buy-low Russia stands up and solemnly weighs the arguments and votes guess who with. Now, the fact that you and I can accept this so nonchalantly means that we are definitely subject to communist influence, and I'm worried about you. Ms. Frank.
I would like to answer Mr. Law's...
Answer or ask?
Ask Mr. Law about his government in view of the fact that since 1949, the Kuomintang government has maintained a state of national emergency in Taiwan and maintained the area under its control, the province of Taiwan, under martial law, with the result that the government has suspended most of the guarantees and protections of individual rights and freedom written into the Chinese national constitution.
You have 30 seconds, Mr. Lowe.
And a major
part... You have 30 seconds to answer that.
Yes.
Please proceed.
Is the young lady through with her questioning?
Well, everybody's going to be through unless you hurry.
The answer is very simple. The fact that Taiwan has been able to grow at an annual growth rate of better than 10%, the fact that we welcome 520,000 visitors a year to Taiwan, that people enjoy a prosperous living standard, second only to that of Japan in Asia. Do you think that would be possible if there is all what you think is all that kind of suppression and lack of the constitution freedom?
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the panel. Thank you very much. Sorry.
For a printed copy of this program, send 25 cents to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina, 29205. That address again, Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina, 29205. This program was made possible by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.